Thank you. And welcome, everybody, to Heritage, and welcome specifically to our annual Russell Kirk Lecture, in which we recognize an eminent thinker in the tradition of the father of American conservatism. As you all know, the namesake of this lecture established the philosophical foundations of the modern conservative movement with landmark books, including The Conservative Mind and The Roots of American Order. Kirk was also instrumental in the founding of National Review and Modern Age, and he was also a distinguished fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. Kirk's political philosophy, summarized in 6 canons of conservatism, emphasized tradition and convention, transcendence and piety, political prudence, and ordered liberty. Kirk's application of those canons to contemporary issues through his essays, lectures, and newspaper columns were often provocative and controversial, but always noteworthy. Today, his works and legacy are being preserved and advanced by the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. We are honored to be joined this year by Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. Dr. Hanson is the Martin and Ely Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, whose scholarship focuses on classics and military history. He has taught at Stanford, Hillsdale College, the U.S. Naval Academy, and Pepperdine University. He is the author of hundreds of articles, book reviews, and newspaper editorials on Greek, agrarian, and military history, as well as essays on contemporary culture. He has also written or edited 24 books and is a syndicated columnist for the Tribune Media Services and a weekly columnist for National Review Online. And, I would hasten to add, he is a regular commentator on the Daily Signal and the host of the Victor Davis Hanson Show. Dr. Hanson will speak to us this afternoon on Why Borders Matter, Ancient and Modern. Following his remarks, Dr. Hanson will be joined on stage by our Executive Vice President, Derek Morgan, for some moderated questions and answers. Please join me in welcoming this year's Distinguished Kirk Lecturer, Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I see that the title was Borders, Ancient and Modern. I have to be a little careful. The great British statesman Enoch Powell, remember, and by the way, he was a classicist. I grew up in graduate school reading a lot of works on Herodotus by Enoch Powell, but he destroyed his career by giving a speech on borders, why they matter, ancient and modern. And I think the Rivers of Blood speech, people forget that that was not his idea. He took a line out of Virgil's Aeneid, in which Virgil, I think in a situation very similar to our own when the transition was occurring from the Roman Republic and the values and protocols of Italian agrarianism, and because of the expansion of Rome into a world power, great wealth had transferred from Italy to the east, and you had all of these people coming into Rome, and Virgil felt that as streams coming into a river, they were not becoming like the Tiber. They were separate and there would be hostility. And as you remember, he destroyed his career by invoking that metaphor. But he was actually a very brilliant classicist and a very skilled parliamentarian. If we want to know why borders matter, I don't think we could do any better than go back to the beginning. And the great historian Thucydides, who wrote an incomplete history of the Peloponnesian War, starts this monumental account. If you remember in the first book, in the first section, he wants to explain why the city-states in general and Athens in particular became so powerful, or at least worthy of his historical inquiry. And he will contrast Persia and other different paradigms. And one of the things he says is, in our distant past, nomadic peoples began to settle down, and the first thing they did was to build cities and protect fertile agriculture. and they started to delineate borders. The word in Greek is horos, H-O-R-O-S. They put stones and they marked out their territory. And this was very important because, and he goes on to explain in this preface to his history, that structures, traditions, institutions, a culture could be delineated, and it would not be subject to moving itself or being imposed on by nomadic people. And he talks about the protection of what they call the Kora, the area around the polis or the astu. And that, it's very strange because when you look, I was a military historian of the ancient world, and I wrote a book once, The Other Greeks. I was curious about what caused wars in the ancient world, because we usually think it's natural resources, or it's, the historian Thucydides says actually they can be a result of fear or self-interest or honor. But when you look at the actual cases of why Sparta fought Argos, or why Athens fought Thebes, or why Athens fought Megara, it was always over territory that was in between the two. And so I always thought this would be the most prized farmland in the world. And I lived in Greece almost 3 years, and I would go to all these borders, and they were some of the most god-awful places in the world. But the Greeks felt there had to be a delineation that made Athens separate culturally from Thebes. The Athenians looked at Thebes and they said, my God, these are awful people. That's where people marry their mothers. Oedipus, they gave us the Bacchae, where they go crazy in the mountains and kill people. It's just a bad place, and we want a border. And they had a border at the Oropus. And the same thing with the Argives said this about Sparta. But they were willing to go in kind of a ritualistic fashion to war over these borders, even though they were not of much value, but they were of enormous symbolic value. They were an idea of limitations, that they could say this particular space is ours, and we have the Attic dialect in here, and we have an Athenian democracy in here, and the Boeotians speak a different dialect, and they have a different form of government, and they're distinct. And countries, cities that were on the border, Plataea, that's one of the key episodes of the Peloponnesian War. They are fought over, and each side tries to take that city and either make it Boeotian or make it Athenian, and they usually end up destroying those cities. So important were borders. This idea, of course, transmogrified in the Hellenistic period, but especially Rome, and they came up with the word limes, and that's the idea of a constant border. So as Rome started to expand, they were met with certain realities that the more that they expanded, the more that the culture that allowed them to be so dynamic was diluted. And this got to the point when the empire was founded in the reign of Augustus and then the 5 good Caesars that followed, that if we go any further, we cannot incorporate people that are going to be assimilated or want to be assimilated, or we would want to assimilate. And they looked for natural boundaries or limitations. And it wasn't just that they were defensive limitations, they were defendable, they were natural, like the Rhine and the Danube. But the Rhine and the Danube separated Germania, Germany. And in their way of thinking, in a cost-to-benefit analysis, to go across the Danube or the Rhine or have those tribes come in was not going to work, because they were not like the Gauls, or they were not like the Iberians. They had a very different culture. They were a blood and soil nation. And that decision to limit the borders of the Roman Empire at the Tiber and the Danube became very important in later European history. Tacitus, the great historian, wrote something called the Germania, in which he romanticized German culture. This was at the age of the great expansion had ceased, and it was the consolidation of Rome. It's what Gibbon called the greatest period of human prosperity and safety, the so-called 5 good emperors from Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius and Antonius Pius, that 100-year period. And he was looking at Germany, and he said there were certain things that were it was sort of like Rousseau's idealization of the natural savage. The women bathe in cold water, they're bare-breasted, people drink milk, they worship trees. It was kind of a romance. But the idea was it's separate. And you can see it in German culture. It's really the only language except for Basque that is not Basque isn't Indo-European, but it's the only language that's not really have a romance element. And when you look at the German, I would call them almost the nihilist philosophers, George Hegel, Friedrich Nietzsche, Oswald Spengler, there was this idea, and I think it's been very, unfortunately in the 20th century, it had very negative associations, but the Germans were the only blood and soil nation in Europe. We were the ones that resisted Roman mongrelization. That Germans were people who spoke a language and looked supposedly like each other, and they were never conquered by the Romans, and they kind of mystified that, and you can see where it went in the First and Second World Wars. But the point I am making, that Rome made that decision that this area of Europe was not going to be colonized, and it was not going to be touched, and the people coming in, and actually if you look at the 5th century, very small numbers in terms of prior existential enemies, maybe 30 or 40,000 of the Goths or Ostrogoths or Vandals, Germanic Polish people or Germanic, very small numbers were able to destroy the Western Empire. So they had some prescient knowledge that this was going to be a problem. The same thing was true of Scotland under the wall of roughly around 122 AD by Hadrian, and then the Antonine Wall that went 75 miles further. The idea that when they got up to Scotland, there were tribes there that they were not able to acculturate, or if they were able to acculturate, there would be too much effort and a cost benefit, and they were going to draw a firm border. The Antonine Wall didn't work, but the Hadrian's Wall worked pretty well. But what I'm getting at, whether it's a Greek or Roman concept, there was this idea that as a system becomes successful, the city-state, and transmogrifies into the Hellenistic world, or the Republic transmogrifies into the empire, at some point people feel that the original values are becoming diluted. It could be in a small state, but Athens is very powerful, but it doesn't want to necessarily incorporate any more than it can handle in the empire, the Athenian Empire. But at some point they feel that they have to have a defensive system. And it's not just to protect what they have, but also to remind themselves, as the will of Augustus supposedly read, that you should not go ever beyond the Danube or the Rhine River. What is it, this goes through Europe, the Treaty of Westphalia in basically 1645 that ended the 30 Years' War. They came to the idea that there had to be if we were going to have these separate kingdoms, and which the Roman word natio was increasingly being used, they had to have borders that were recognized, that each country had to realize they have a unique system. In the original reference I mentioned, Thucydides, this is associated with civilization, and pre-borders are pre-civilizational. And you can almost suggest in the modern world that you have pre-civilizational without borders, civilizational with borders, and post-civilization without borders. And so if you look at this evolution, and we don't have time to go through it, all of European history, but I think that people in the past would say to us, if you're in the United States and you don't have a border and you're not able to defend it, and you have 16% of the population is coming into the United States, and you have 55 million people, and you do not have a method any longer of assimilation, adaptation, and integration, and you've lost confidence in your own values, and you're saying, who are we to input our civilization or our culture on a different person? And you have a rivers of blood idea that you're going to have all these different constituencies. That's not going to work, and it's going to end up as a post-civilizational morass. And where you see it very distinctly is in Europe, where Europe was pre-civilizational. They went through the Greek and Roman periods, and then after the 30 Years' War, they had these nation states. They were warring, and people felt after World War II that the solution to all of these problems was not to have national borders, but a European-wide border. That might have worked if they really did have a national border. And the fact is they don't. The birth rate of Europe is about 1.43, and they've had about 50 to 60 million people come in, mostly from the Middle East, that have not assimilated after 2 or 3 generations. And I think if you go to some of the suburbs of Paris or Amsterdam or Rotterdam or Ammonia Square in Athens, you'll see that there are entire enclaves or parts of what was formerly East Berlin in Germany. There's large segments of the population, multi-generational, that either speak their native language or they don't believe in that the country that they came to is preferable from the country they left, or they don't feel fully part of Germany or fully part in a way that even supersedes our own problem. One of the things, just as a parenthesis about walls, people today have deprecated a wall. I looked up the other day, there's more walls being built now in Europe than ever before. Mostly Eastern Europeans walling themselves off with borders of the former Soviet Union, Belarus, for example, or the Baltic states walling themselves off from Russia. Greece is walling themselves off from Turkey. Bulgaria is walling themselves off from Turkey, and it's kind of counterintuitive because we've been told by our sophisticates that walls don't work. We were told that about our border wall. It won't work. And it misses the spirit of the ancients that built walls. And if you read what they wrote about walls or how they actually operated in the ancient world or the medieval world, they were never designed for absolute safety. Even the long walls of Athens were breached. Xenophon says the Spartans tore them down to the music of fife players. But the point was they cost the enemy a great deal, or the intruder a great deal of capital and time to get over them, and they would rather not do it. They were deterrent, and they allowed less people to defend territory with a wall than without one. And I think you can see when you looked at the patterns of illegal immigration during the Biden administration, the nexuses were places where there was vast gaps in the new wall, maybe where the old wall was, but the actual wall that had been built that was new, the 37 miles, or the areas that had been rehabilitated, they actually did deter people, and that was surprising to a lot of people. So I think when we look at borders in antiquity, walls do really work in the sense that they're never designed for absolute impenetrability. They're designed to allow fewer people to defend territory more efficiently. Even the Maginot Line that we always laugh about, why did France spend 20% of GDP between World War I and World War II when the Germans just went around it? And that's the point, isn't it? It was never finished. It got up to the Belgian border, and the Belgians said to the French, if you wall us off, we're in deep trouble. And the French said to them, well, then defend yourself and spend this much on GDP. Same argument as today. And they refused to do it, and France did not finish the wall. And the Germans came through the Ardennes around the wall through Belgium. They would have had they did have Army Group South tried to go over the Maginot Line, but that was after it was already breached from the rear. The French security was. My point is that walls do work. The best example in the ancient world are the Theodosian walls of Theodosius II in Constantinople. If anybody's ever seen them, they are the one area that is vulnerable at the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire. Remember that the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara protect three sides of Constantinople. But the problem with the city was there was a flat plain of about 4 miles that was near what we call the Hellespont, and it was easily approached, and they didn't really know what to do with. And the Emperor Theodosius then built a tripart wall. You can still see it today. And it was 3 separate walls with moats, towers, killing grounds that were paved in between, and a mound finally. And it was all designed so that when people tried to breach the borders of the imperial city, they would lose 15% on the outside wall, 20% going over the mound, 50%, and by the time they got to the final and largest wall, they would be unable to breach it. That wall lasted for 1,000 years. It was not breached until May 22nd, Black Tuesday of 1453, when the Ottomans finally went over it. And the Ottomans went over it the last day. They were deliberating to call off the siege. And 2 of the commanders convinced the Sultan to do one more try. And even then, they probably would have been able to keep the wall had not Mr. Giustiniani been fatally wounded. The wall was defended by 7,000 people in a city that had once been 1.5 million and was down to 50,000. So the net result, before we go into the modern period very quickly, is that there is a sense through history that borders and walls are integral to protecting a society's unique culture and its own, I guess you would say, modesty or sense of self-control or self-limitations. And it resists the urge that we all have when successful systems seem to have solved economic, military, social, cultural problems, that you want to expand and use that imprint to help other people. Remember, the Romans never said that they were conquering people to destroy them. That was their enemies who said they make a desert and call it peace. They felt they were spreading civilization. The British never said they were out to kill people or conquer people. They thought they were there to bring them the benefits of British law, habeas corpus, and sophisticated sewer and water. And there was a lot of truth to that. But the point, again, is you could make the argument that why the British were losing 1,200 people at Isla Wanda fighting the Zulus. Dickensian London hadn't much changed in 25 years. You could say that the capital and the manpower that was all over the world was not reflective of what the inner city of London was like at that time. And I think if anybody today looked at our somewhere 650 military installations, and they looked at the rural San Joaquin Valley or downtown Fresno, they would think that this society has no economic, cultural, social ability to project this power all over the world when these cities, and we could name all of them. We just left San Francisco, the same thing. These cities seem to be failing or dying in the core while we're exporting this wonderful culture. It's a wonderful culture worldwide. Which brings us to the southern border. We were in the age, I think we're in the postmodern age of ecumenical globalization, where the southern border, which had been closed finally by the Trump administration, then it was opened by the Biden administration. And no one really knows why they did it. I mean, Mr. Mayorkas looked the America in the face every 6 weeks, why usually if it was Fox News or a conservative outlet had pictures of 10,000 people crossing the border in a day, and he said with a straight face, the border is secure. Everybody knew it wasn't secure. What they didn't know is why they didn't want it secure. Why did they do such a thing? It's going to take a generation or two to find the 12 million people, 10 million who came in, if you do want to find them, and another generation to return to the melting pot rather than the salad bowl to integrate all of these new people on the basic civic education and traditions and language and culture of the United States. And it won't work if you believe that we don't really have that anymore, that we have been diluted or we're transformed into a global system that's not uniquely American, that we're sort of like the 3rd or 4th century in Rome. But why did we do that? Why did we open the border? And I've looked at all of the reasons, and they're very interesting. There were so many vested interests. You could make the argument that the left really did feel that their agenda, their, I guess what you'd call their policies, were truly what the Trump people claimed were true. They were 30-70 or 20-80 policies. That people really didn't want illegal immigration. People really didn't want something like Afghanistan. People really didn't want biological men in women's sports. People really didn't want the New Green Deal. People really didn't want defund the police. They didn't want any of the cultural, social, and they were losing, and therefore they felt they needed a new constituency. Now, of course, anybody who said that, they demonized as saying that you believe in the Great Replacement theory. But the people who believed in the Great Replacement theory were the left, because they wrote books with the titles such as The New Democratic Majority or Demography is Destiny. That came from the left. And their idea was, I think, that with this waxen effigy as president, they had a unique, it was not a liability, this was a unique opportunity to enact a very progressive, radical agenda that they might not ever have a chance again under the veneer of old Joe Biden from Scranton. And it worked beautifully. Everybody thinks it was a failure. They had the most radical agenda reified in my lifetime, your lifetime. So we brought in 12 million people, I think because they felt either one of two things, that under the radical changes in the voting law of 2020, in which in about 16 states, you could vote early for a phenomenal amount of time that we've never quite seen, for months, or you could have a mail-in ballot. I know that in some of the swing states, the 30% who did not vote on Election Day in 2020 turned into be 70%. And a lot of the statistics suggest that of that 70% that didn't vote on Election Day, 57 to 65% were Democrats. They had mastered that phenomenon. And I think they might have felt that people that were coming in, there would be less audit, and they would either be future constituents or immediate constituents politically, or they felt that they were losing constituents and they were going to bring in millions of people who would be in need of instant parity and housing and education and legal help and food, and that would grow the government and grow the entitlement industry and raise taxes and redistribute. That was part of the momentum, I think, behind the massive. The other explanation, another one, is they were just incompetent. They opened the border. They thought maybe we were going to get 1,000 a day. Never in their right mind did they believe 15,000. I don't believe that, but I've heard that said. The Mexican government had a lot to do with it. They had been chastised by the Trump administration prior and had begun to patrol the border, both the border with us and Guatemala. But I think you can make the argument that it was a win-win situation for Mexico. Mr. Obrador said that. He said, we've sent 40 million of our citizens, and it's a beautiful thing we've done that. And right now, we have about $63 billion that leave the United States to Mexico in remittances. We don't know how many of those people are here illegally, but there's the suggestion that the majority of people sending the 63 million have two things in common. They are residing in the United States either as green card holders or illegal aliens, and they're on some form. California, 40% of the entire population is on Medi-Cal. 50% of all births are on Medi-Cal. They're on some source of public support that frees up $350, $400 a month to send back to southern Mexico. So that's the largest source of foreign exchange for Mexico, 63 billion. That is in addition to another 60 billion that's leaving the United States for Central American countries, which is a much newer phenomenon. So there was a sense in the South that the more pressure you could put on the United States, that would be do not police their own southern borders and encourage people to come to the United States. It was going to be a win-win situation. There's 50 Mexican consulates now in the United States for that express purpose. And I know some people on the right felt that it was sort of, because if you read La Raza literature, which is kind of a diminishing genre, and a lot of people don't read it anymore, but it was the idea that this was payback for the Mexican War. I think what the real problem was for the open borders people was that when you started to slow immigration, the natural processes that have been discredited still are in existence organically without government help. That is assimilation, integration, intermarriage, because we're into 3 or 4 generations of Mexican American people, and they're starting to follow the paradigm of Italian Americans in the 1920s. 1910, large numbers of people in dire need of public support or in poverty, very left-wing, going up through the middle classes, centrist, and then by the 1960s, it was very hard to tell if your name was de Blasio or Giuliani, what your politics were. And I think we were getting to that point, at least in California, we're starting to, if your name is Rodriguez or Lopez, we have no idea what your politics are, especially in the center of the state. And I think that was a very, very frightening idea to the Democratic Party. I think a lot of people sensed the idea that their agenda was not popular, but new constituents might change that agenda, and they had lost the immigrant communities that were assimilating and starting to turn their attention to the price of gas, inflation, safety in their streets. The other people who were interested, not so much as we saw, were the corporate interests. Believe it or not, only 20% of the labor that comes across the border is used by corporate agriculture. That's because of mechanization. People don't realize that when the border started to be closed, it had the greatest effect in really the history of California agriculture, Arizona in mechanizing. Things that you thought you could never mechanize, like raisins. How do you pick grapes and dry them on the ground without a machine? I mean, with a machine, and we did that. It's almost all mechanized now. Almonds are all mechanized. And it was an idea that there was a dearth of labor, and the people who operated the machines now were skilled people like plumbers and electricians. So I'm not sure that that's still an explanation that there was a desire for cheap labor. I once debated Milton Friedman. First thing I ever did at Hoover, they asked me to debate him on open borders. And I asked him, did he want to close it? And he said, no, we'll let the market adjudicate. And I said, well, Professor Friedman, what would the market adjudicate? How low do wages? He said, well, when wages get 50 cents, people won't come. We'll let the market adjudicate. And I said, but you're going to be not in the pathway where this 20-year process is going to be occurring. I will be in Fresno and out in a farm. And I've seen what happens when you bring large numbers of people in. But there was a sense in the business or corporate world that you just let the natural organic process of wage control change the border. So in conclusion, borders have always mattered through antiquity. Walls do work. Immigration has always been a political situation, a political issue, and most people, I think, in responsible positions of power have understood that open borders do not work, and that you have to have some, if you have a culture, at least a definable culture, and you think you have a definable culture, then it has to have a definable space to be protected, and that you can have legal immigration if it's measured, and the people who are coming in are going to be educated and assimilated and transformed into citizens. And what's very unique about the West, and I think it's the only culture, is that it really does believe in a multiracial, single culture democracy. And I don't think that China does. I don't think many of the African countries do. I don't think that Japan does. I don't think Korea does. But the idea that if you accept Americanism and the characteristics of our citizenship, we don't really care what you look like. It's going to be a more difficult process because you'll have a different language and a different culture to come into democracy. But by the same token, if you do have an open border and you do have a multiracial, multicultural society and you don't assimilate people, then that is a formula for catastrophe. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you. Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Hanson. That was brilliant, and I think we can all see why a degree in classics and studying of classics is really useful, even for maybe especially for contemporary political
Yeah. When I came home,
issues.
my father said, "So you got a PhD in classical languages?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You know how to rewire the 220 pump?" I said, "No." And my older brother was working. He said that he was kind of literate. He was very literate, so he knew Samuel Jones. He said, "Well, Victor's like a dog that dances on two legs. It's impressive, but we don't know what the reason is." What for? That was what knowing Greek was, he said.
Well, it gives us such great perspective because you can step out. You know, a lot of times as a culture, we're so in our kind of post-World War II and now post-Cold War moment that sometimes we can't see the longer, rhyming of history, so to speak. But I wonder if you gave a great course at Hillsdale on citizenship.
Yes.
And by the way, it's free to everybody. Just go to Hillsdale and sign up. I took it. It was wonderful. Could you give us just a little bit about why citizenship is so important in the context of borders? You've got the borders, but why is it that citizenship itself also really matters?
Well, in the negative sense is that you have a particular privilege that everybody understands, that if you were born with certain citizenship rights, and that's different than residency, mere residency. If you're an immigrant, you come in and you become a citizen. It's kind of like the Roman idea of civis Romanus sum. That was what Cicero said, that every Roman had on his lips wherever he went. It was a privilege, and it made you feel part of something unique. And when you look at what a citizen can do and what a resident can do, they've conflated. And I can't think of any difference anymore. I think that's part of our problem with immigration. It used to be that only citizens could be in military service. That's not there. Only citizens could go across the border without the permission of a government. We see in the southern border, anybody goes across. It was the only citizens could work in campaigns. We saw a lot of people that were not citizens working in political campaigns. Only citizens could hold office. You can be vote. We know in school board elections in San Francisco and Cambridge, non-citizens are voting. I think the last unique exclusivity of a citizen is they can hold office. I can't think of any difference. That might be why the Simpson-Mazzoli Act of 1986, that amnesty that Reagan signed on to, I think only 36% of those who were eligible for citizenship actually took up citizenship. And the reason they didn't was they couldn't see any advantage of it necessarily. They could get the same public support. There was no difference. And I think when the citizen feels he's not unique, and you could see that with people coming in the inner city and getting hotel accommodations in Chicago or New York, or I could see it at the Fresno airport when people had to follow certain rules about showing passports or driver's license or real IDs, and they were flying people in the middle of the night from Mexico with an app, and they had no passport control. There was a sense that not only are residents blended in with citizens, but residents are giving unique advantages, that citizenship was a disadvantage. So that's a very pre-modern idea, I think, that you don't have a border and you don't have a unique classification of a citizen that votes. And then a democracy or constitutional republic won't work unless you have a uniformed body of people who have gone through the process of civic education. And we don't do that anymore, especially for people who are here as immigrants.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the citizenship exam is actually pretty good. And those who go through naturalization, that's a great process. They end up knowing quite a bit about civics.
Yes.
And we wonder sometimes if our native population is getting that same education. I think we unfortunately know the answer to that.
I don't think so. I think one of the mistakes that we all made about diversity, equity, and inclusion was that it was an act of commission. And really it was an act of omission. It was a vast diversion of resources away from the Martin Luther King idea that it's the content of our character rather than the color of our skin, or our race should be incidental rather than essential to who we are. And we forgot that, and we started using the DEI and permeating every aspect of science, health, geography, history, at the expense that we just didn't have enough time in the school year to tell people what I can remember the first time I ever encountered DEI. I had a student, I was teaching Homer's Iliad to minority students, and a young woman said, as a Latina, this doesn't appeal to me. And I kept saying, please don't use that word. We're arguing about your race or this race. This is a universal experience. You have just as much in common with Penelope as I do with Odysseus. It doesn't matter what color. But she kept saying, I'm a Latina. And I said, if you do it again, I'm going to do what you do. And I said, well, as a white man, I can't. And the next thing I know, the dean called me in. And so all that was just a distraction from the Iliad or the Odyssey. And that's what's happened in our whole society. We're so fixated on our superficial appearance. We're neglecting the basic elements of citizenship and civic education.
Yeah, and the whole idea of e pluribus unum.
Yeah,
you know, our
there's
national
not enough
motto.
room for time in the day. Yeah.
There's a couple of governors and states that are working to make the citizenship test, mandatory for high school graduates to
Yes.
get a diploma, which is not a bad idea.
Yeah,
perhaps.
I've seen that.
Yeah. You talked a lot about assimilation. By the way, we're going to get to your questions in just a minute, so please be thinking about your questions for Dr. Hanson. I've got one or two more. You spoke a lot about assimilation, and we just were speaking about assimilation as well. And you see some scary things in Europe. You mentioned some of the outskirts of Paris and Amsterdam and so forth. We saw a couple of years ago in Dearborn, people cheering, attacks on Israel and so forth here in our own backyard. How worried are you about kind of enclaves or that sort of thing in the United States? Is that, are we following in the path of Europe in that regard, or do you think that will wane?
Well, it's hard not to be emotional when we've witnessed the last 2 years since October 7th on our campuses, when some of us think if you were in a war-torn place like Syria or the West Bank or Egypt or any country, you came over here and you were given a generous scholarship by your government, and you were invited in by your host, and you were the beneficiary, as residents are, the full protection of the Constitution. And you were a guest. I know I was a guest, as I said, in Greece, and the idea that I spoke, I went to Greek universities at places, the idea that I would ever protest my host government would be so shocking. I think that they would have put me in jail. But the idea that they have an attitude, they come over here and then they start delineating grievances against their host to the point where it leads to violence. It's really disturbing. So I think that the country cannot handle much more than 500,000 immigrants. And because we're so anti-meritocratic, if we say the process is facilitated not by the color of your skin, we don't care, but to the degree you took the effort to learn some English, you might have had a high school diploma, and you have a skill set, it would make the whole process much easier. But we've done just the opposite. We discourage people that have those skill sets. And I don't think a lot of people if you don't live in an area, I live in an area where it's ground zero of illegal immigration. And there's things you have to be very careful, but I can tell you that from the beginning of the Biden administration to the end, the number of refrigerators, car seats, and dryers that were thrown in my orchard increased exponentially. The numbers of people I met on my evening walk that had an armed pistol or gun that were members maybe of a cartel, and the number of animals that were thrown out their door because they couldn't afford it or something that we adopted. These were just minor things that just accelerated when you're bringing in that many people into Fresno County. The number of accidents where the drivers left the scene of the accident. It's almost 50% in Fresno County. So the left never talks about all of the, they think they love humanity, but they don't like humans. They don't care about how all these global ideas affect real people. People in the inner city, I mean, people, African-American community were telling Mayor Johnson that they didn't have access to dialysis or they didn't have access to clinics because for some reason he wanted to bring all these people from southern Mexico and dump them there and let them deal with it. And I never understood the morality of it. Not the practicality. I saw that it was impractical, but why did they want to do that to people?
Well, we're very honored that you gave the Russell Kirk Lecture here, and place was very important to him as well in Michigan, rural Michigan. That was important to him. I know your ancestral home in California is very important to you. What is the connection for conservatives between place and lineage? Like, why is that such an important part of your thought?
I think it's really important. I think most conservatives think they have a place in the United States or home, or they identify with a region, they understand they move, and a lot of people on the left feel that they're citizens of the world. They have no place. It's all indistinguishable to them. They have a mode or an operation. If they get assigned to a university community and somebody says, you're associate professor at 50,000, we'll make you a professor at 80,000, they'll just go like that, or back and forth. But conservatives more think that they're part of a local community, they're part of an ancestry, they have traditions to uphold, they're more of a shame culture than a private guilt culture. In other words, they know people around them, they don't, I think, and it doesn't have to be lasting. I think one of the successes of Hillsdale College, they were able to inculcate in that 4 years that they're in a particular place and a particular culture. And I noticed, I gave the graduation address and I mentioned this, but the first day I got there, I rode a bike and I left it in the middle of campus. If I had been at Cal State Fresno, it would have been gone in 2 seconds. I came the next day and it was still there. And I would ask people, and they'd say things that were just incredible as a Californian to hear. Well, if somebody took it, what would you do? You wouldn't have a bike. Or somebody might see me and they would think I was a thief. Or you would go back and tell people that Hillsdale stole your bike. So they were thinking in the terms of their reputation or their shame or the people who had come before them. They didn't want to sully the reputation of Hillsdale. So, and that idea is a regional idea originally, and multi-generation, all these things that we deprecated and my generation destroyed, but the idea of a multi-generational family living. I grew up with my grandparents, uncle, all on one farm. It was kind of tribal, but I learned about the 19th century from the accents of my grandparents, and I was always happy. Every time I got on a tractor at 8 or 9, my grandfather said, "Oh, you're so lucky. You don't have to put horse up Pete and Jim, the horses. You can just zoom out." He never learned how to drive a tractor. But so there's a lot of value. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be that way, but if you have 10 or 20% of the population, and they tend to be conservative, I think that they serve as a break on the madness of popular culture.
Very well said. All right, we have microphones. So this gentleman here in the second row, we'll get our first question. Just identify yourself and a brief question so we can get a lot of questions in.
J.P. Hogan. America being a republic versus nation on borders. There's the old adage, when a nation loses its religion, it stops being a nation. Our republic is about a religious freedom. So I just wanted, if you could speak to the difference between nation in America not necessarily being our republic. So a lot of these borders, where do you break it? Have you studied that?
About borders,
nation versus republic.
Yes.
So if the old borders was a nation stops being a nation when it loses its religion, and ours is for religious liberty to have our areas have their own faith areas. Have you spoken to those points?
Yeah, I think so. I think a republic, a consensual society that grew up in one place, or it had a sense of place that it had borders, when you globalize that or you dilute that, and then you make no requirements on the people, and Thucydidean terms that migrate into your country, and you don't ask them of anything. The first thing that I think happens is if a person goes across a border and he's permitted to do that and it's illegal, then the second thing that happens, he resides there illegally. And then the third thing that happens, he gets some type of identification that's not valid to allow him to reside there. Then you create a mentality, and then you expand that to 50 million people or 40 million people or 30, then you wonder if there's a sense of contempt by the migrant that these people don't even care enough about their borders. They let me in, I broke the law, nothing happens to me, I can keep breaking the law. And I know I've talked to people, and I've said things to them like, well, this isn't your property. I walk at night, and they'll say, what do you mean it's not my property? I just came here. I can go everywhere. I can go anywhere I want. So borders are the first line of psychological, mental definition and delineation of a society. And you can see when even today in borderless Europe, when you go across a particular border, you can see a radical difference, even in this vestigial age. When I go from Greece to Turkey, I see a very different society, very different. One that has a functional democracy, it's a Christian nation, one that's Islamic and has a non-functional democracy. And I'm not trying to be pejorative to Turkey, but borders are very important. And when they don't have borders, you have a nebulous system, an imperial, just subjects. I think subjects are places where there's not national borders, and citizens are places where there is.
All right, we've got a question right here, and then I'll go over here.
Hello, Professor Hanson. My name is Mike Onisick, and I have kind of a two-part question. Number one, one of the most important things of any nation is sovereignty, and you give that up with open borders, right?
Yes.
And number two, there's a take care clause, Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, which requires the President of the United States to execute the laws faithfully on the books. And open borders is not anywhere in any of the immigration laws.
Yeah. Well, that came up when people on the right said they impeached Donald Trump twice, and they felt that surely the first one was illegitimate. The second one, there was more controversy over. But they said, should we, when we get the House, impeach Joe Biden? I thought there was nothing, being incompetent or non compos mentis was not necessarily impeachable, but you were absolutely right. I thought that he had deliberately not enforced immigration law, and that should have been an impeachable offense. And I think the public would have supported that. I think it would have been good as a reminder, even though it would have not passed the Senate with the necessary 2/3 vote, 60 votes. So I agree entirely with you. That was the worst thing of all the things that happened the last 4 years. And I don't want to dwell on it, but it was almost nihilistic. It was almost intended to say to the people of the United States, or a particular segment, we're going to destroy your border, and we're going to let in 10 million people. We don't care if 500,000 of them have a criminal record. We're going to say to our military people, if you don't get the COVID 8,500 vaccine, 8,500 of you are going to be drummed out, but we're not going to ask one immigrant to have a COVID vaccination. It was just bizarre. It was Orwellian.
Yeah, we at Heritage put together the case for impeachment of Mayorkas along the same lines,
Yes.
which the House did do.
I didn't understand why we didn't keep going,
Yeah, I think unfortunately the
Yeah.
Senate numbers just weren't there.
It was
Yeah. Let's go back here toward the back, and then we'll come over here.
Sir, my name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. I'm going to ask, I agree with a lot of stuff you said, Dr. Hanson. I'll ask you a very provocative question. Why didn't you say that the left, which is part of the head of the Democratic Party, hates you and your supporters, which is the Republican Party and the right wing, more than the criminals from Central and South America? I'm putting it in a very provocative language because
Why
that's
did
how
I
I
say
look at
that?
it.
I put it out there in confusion, and I gave a number of reasons why the border was open, and I asked myself, for someone to engineer a policy which would be so costly to the country at large and so injurious in particular to particular groups where these groups were relocated. We saw what happened at Martha's Vineyard when they were relocated where the architects of this system lived. I didn't know. That was a legitimate question. Why would somebody enact a policy that was illegal and undermine the law? And I don't know, but I know that every time that Joe Biden was asked about it, he turned the question around and said that people who were worried about it were racist or nativist or xenophobes, and that he wasn't like that. But every time that red state people wanted a little nemesis and put the immigrants in areas under blue state control, the people that were the hosts flipped around 180 degrees. So you went Eric Adams, when there were 10 people getting off a bus, he met them and gave them a bottle of water. By the time it was over, he was no longer a Democrat. And so, and Mayor Johnson had been elected by an overwhelming margin of the black community, but when he helped engineer this and injured his own constituency, his polls, I think now are 8% among the African American community, if not the whole population. So I didn't understand, but it is, and when you did a poll and asked who supported this, it was about 50-50 on the Democrats and about 10% of Republicans, if that high. This was, whether we liked to be partisan or not, this was mostly a project of the left today. And it was either an abstract policy that they don't believe in borders at all and they believe in globalization, so they were indifferent to the natural, or it was an idea that it was a DEI idea that the population, the white population was aging and it was corrupt and it was this new influence was going to remake America. I heard a lot of that from the left. Or it was just purely partisan, that these were constituents that would be soon voters. I will say that I think the borders were going to stay closed because whatever the next administration is, if it's Republican, it will continue the Trump policies, and if it's Democrats, it will not want constituencies that turn into Republican. And they think now that the Hispanic community can no longer be relied on to be predictably left-wing, because other issues are more important to them, like inflation, gas, cost of living, safety. And I think some of the most racist things I heard about the 2024 election came from the left, in the context of these people have betrayed us after all we did for the Hispanic community. Really, I mean, it was all over.
We have time for one more. I know we have over 2,000 people registered to view online. Do we have an online question, Catherine? No, we don't. Okay, we can take one more in the room then. We'll go right here. Last question. Make it brief.
Mario Loyola, senior fellow here at Heritage. So Professor Hanson, as you talked, I found myself thinking more and more back to the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, which was used by the slaveholding states to increase their voting representation in Congress in proportion to their sort of subject population. And then I started thinking about how through time the left, the progressive movement, the Democratic Party have kept creating one big subject population after another. Or this was the purpose of the New Deal, the Great Society. And now with the open border stuff, it seemed to me that the logical reason to let all these people in was not even, was just to have yet another population of 10 million people that depended on them and their largesse to use for extraction and to increase their political power. How dangerous is dependency for citizenship in a republic?
Well, it's very dangerous, and as you know, Aristotle talks about that in the Politics, about the city-state rest on an autonomous, and he used the word archaic, a person who's economically independent, a mesos, that was very important for the idea of the beginning of Western civilization. Your citizenry is politically autonomous, but more importantly, they're economically autonomous. They're not serfs and they're not slaves. Well, they had slaves, but not as citizens. And there was a big chauvinism about the middle class that lacked the Machiavellian influence of the wealthy and yet the subservience of the subsidized poor. But in the Dying Citizens, I talked a lot about what you're talking about, that with dependencies and new constituencies, it really empowered the left. So I was shocked when I went through law journals and saw serious articles that said, for example, it's not fair that California has 20 million people for each senator, Wyoming gets 250,000, and therefore, and then what would follow were all these ideas of making the Senate one big house and violating the spirit and the mind and the law of the founders, or reapportioning the House of Representatives was not large enough, or it was ossified, it represented dying constituencies when you had all new people, so that the House should have 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 members. And I don't think we realize that in left-wing legal circles, there's a whole corpus of thought about how to democratize, that's a term they use, the Constitution by making the Senate exactly like the House and expanding the House and then packing the court. And of course, the distance from a law review article or a scholarly journal to actual enaction is pretty quick, as we saw with these latest proposals to pack the court by Elizabeth Warren and others.
Well, we've reached the conclusion of our time. I want to invite our guests here to enjoy lunch, and please join me in thanking Dr. Hanson.
Thank you. Thank you.